So today we're going to be talking about Brexit and the protection of animals used in farming. The current position is that most UK legislation on farm animal welfare is derived from EU law, and EU law both shapes and is shaped by the United Kingdom. So there are EU directives which lay down minimum standards for animals in farm husbandry, with specific provisions for pigs, calves, broilers, chickens and laying hens. And there are also EU regulations on welfare during transport and slaughter. So in 2016, the referendum meant the British people voted to leave the EU, and after withdrawal, EU treaties will cease to apply. The consequence of this is that the UK will be excluded from some key EU institutions and technical committees, but UK originated laws will stay, such as the Animal Welfare Act, which is a domestic piece of legislation. EU regulations which apply automatically in member states will cease to have effect, but EU directives which have been implemented through domestic legislation will still have effect through that legislation. So in preparation for Britain leaving the EU, the UK Centre for Animal Law, of which I'm chair, and the Wildlife and Countryside Link Group coordinated a report published by the animal protection groups working in this area, looking at what it was that we wanted to see after Britain leaves the EU. What were the challenges and what were the opportunities presented by Brexit for reforming the law in a positive way for animals? And there is a section in that report on animals in agriculture. So what were the key recommendations in the report? In relation to farming, the recommendations included a ban on live export of animals, introducing strong new welfare incentives in British farming, introducing new animal product labelling laws, banning the import of products such as foie gras, working with the UK fisheries to promote humane catches, and introducing new legal protections for invertebrates such as crabs, octopus, lobsters and squid. Broadly, the reforms could be broken down into two very key headline areas: trade and post-CAP, that's the Common Agricultural Policy, payment subsidies to farmers. So these are the two big headline issues. So what were the recommendations around trade? Well, currently EU laws prevent import prohibitions on products produced to lower animal welfare standards. So after leaving the EU, groups have asked that new trade deals could contain a clause permitting a requirement that the import standards meet UK animal welfare and health standards. There's also recommendations that domestic and imported goods are labelled as to method of production, and as we've mentioned, a ban on foie gras imports, and also considering a ban on live export of animals for slaughter. And what about agricultural subsidies and support payments? Well, the groups have asked that new farm support payments should reward better animal welfare and environmental standards. And that could be achieved, for example, by additional payments for achieving higher welfare standards than the legislative minimum. And that could, for example, encourage a move away from fast-growing broiler chicken genotypes and a move to free farrowing systems for sows. What are the other recommendations in the report? Some we've touched upon: extending protection to farm animal welfare protection to crustaceans and decapods, phasing out zero grazing for dairy cows, decreasing maximum permitted stocking density for broiler chickens, and banning the use of enriched cages for laying hens are just some of the examples of the recommendations made by animal welfare groups. So what's happened subsequently? Let's start with farming subsidies. The government has now published the Agricultural Bill, and this provides the legislative power for a system of farming based on the delivery of certain public goods, rather than it being based upon the amount of land usage. And animal welfare has been defined in clause 1 of that bill as a public good, alongside other public goods, which might include, for example, public access to the countryside, mitigating or adapting to climate change, and preventing or reducing environmental hazards. So as the command paper says, that was a precursor to the bill, this could incentivise methods of farming that create new habitats for wildlife, that increase biodiversity and reduce flood risk. And it does that by ensuring that public money is spent on public good. So it's that concept of public money for public good. And animal welfare was identified in the bill, or in the command paper, as a priority area, along with environmental enhancements. And it was identified that that could be achieved, for example, by targeted payments to farmers who meet higher welfare outcomes beyond the legislative baseline. So then moving on to imports, exports, trade. Well, foie gras is one of those areas that's been quite contentious. Geese can be force-fed to fatten their livers, and such production would not be lawful in the United Kingdom. But in fact, the UK imports between 180 to 200 tonnes of foie gras each year under EU free market rules. And an amendment was tabled to the Agriculture Bill to end the imports of foie gras, but in fact that was defeated at committee stage. And what DEFRA has said about that is the Agriculture Bill is not the place to make provisions for trade and import. So it's not necessarily the case that the debate is over. It may be that this will be the subject of further trade agreements if the UK leaves the EU and forges new relationships with other member states within the EU. But trade is an area that has been identified as a risk area for animal welfare. And in Steve McCulloch's paper, Brexit and Animal Welfare Impact Assessment, he identifies that a major threat of Brexit is the import of meat and dairy products to the UK, raised in lower welfare standards from nations such as the United States. And he says the development of Brexit policy suggests that this is a significant risk that this threat will materialise. He points out that the Agriculture Bill has no provision to protect British farmers from the import of low welfare products, and that this threat is also one that has been identified and acknowledged by the Commons Select Committee, the EFRA Committee, who have scrutinised the Agriculture Bill, and their chair, Neil Parish, has said, imports produced to lower standards than ours pose a very real threat to UK agriculture. Without sufficient safeguards, we could see British farmers significantly undermined while turning a blind eye to environmental degradation and poor animal welfare standards abroad. And they have supported an amendment that calls for agricultural goods to be imported into the UK only if the standards to which those goods were produced are as high or higher than current UK standards. Now, there have been two amendments tabled to the Agriculture Bill to this effect that have not been successful, and also an amendment to the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2008 that were also unsuccessful in setting out those sorts of protections to animal welfare. However, the trade bill, the government has backed an amendment to this bill that would ensure that the UK's animal welfare standards are protected post-Brexit. And that would be alongside protecting other existing standards, not only for animal welfare, but for workers' rights and the environment in existing trade agreements. So that looks to be much more positive news. And finally, just a word on live exports, as this is a matter that has attracted quite significant public concern. So a public petition in 2018 to ban the export of live farm animals attracted over 100,000 signatures, and the matter was debated in Parliament in February 2018, and then DEFRA issued a call for evidence in April 2018 to look at this issue of exporting animals live. And what the government has said in relation to this is that once Britain leaves the EU, and in line with their manifesto commitments, they will take early steps to control the export of live farm animals for slaughter. and that they'll be considering the options of further in the context of the departure from the European Union. And they've also made it clear that they would support improvements to the enforcement of existing EU laws in the meantime about long-distance transport of livestock. So discussion has centred around banning live export of animals for slaughter, but not necessarily for fattening, so that's something that will have to be looked at quite carefully. So there's an awful lot going on in relation to animal welfare and Brexit, and animals in agriculture is only one part of that, but it is a very big part given the number of animals used and the welfare consequences.